Hey, thanks for coming by today. When I sit here by the fire in the cabin, I often think what it was like when my great-great-grandparents lived on this farm and lived in a cabin just like this one. And I wonder what it was like to sit here and look into the fire and what it was like to be able to eat the foods that they ate. When I have this little book here, The American Frugal Housewife from 1833, and I read some of these recipes and then make them, I feel that I am eating a lot of the same kinds of foods and things that my great-great-grandparents would have done 175 years ago. Reading from Mrs. Child's book here, she says that a cake of common gingerbread can be stirred up very quick the following way. Rub in a bit of shortening as big as an egg into a pint of flour. Well, here, you may as well read the recipe for yourself. As Mrs. Child told us here, we're going to rub in some shortening into a pint of flour. But I found that with my liner pan for my bake kettle, that this recipe is going to be too big. So I'm only going to make half the recipe today. And so rather than a pint of flour, I'm just going to go ahead and use a cup of flour. So we'll go ahead and measure that up the best we can. Now, some people have wondered, like, what if your cup isn't the same size? Well, this one turns out to be just the size of a standard measuring cup. But if your cup isn't, it really won't make that much difference, because if you use the same size cup for all your measurements, it'll come out in proportion, and the only difference will be that you will have maybe a slightly bigger or slightly smaller cake of gingerbread when you get done, but it probably won't make too much difference. Now, level measurement, of course, my wife tells me, is pioneered by Fanny Farmer years after our time now, so 1 cup of flour. Now, we're supposed to rub into that some shortening. That is the size of a hen's egg. Now, in our case, we're going to have to put in half that much. Now, I've added some shortening here, what I might have guessed to be half the size of a hen's egg, or maybe in modern measurements, 2 tablespoons. And when I grew up, I always used a pastry blender or a fork to work this flour into the shortening. But back in the day, she said to rub it in, so I'm going to do that. I'm just going to go through there and keep pinching these chunks of shortening or chunks of lard and just try to work them in so it makes a kind of a uniform mixture. Now, Mrs. Child tells us to put in a great spoonful of ginger, and also then she used a spoonful of pearl ash, which she mixed into her liquids. What I've done today is I've taken some baking soda or saleratus, and I got my spices, my ginger. I also added some cinnamon and some nutmeg and a little pinch of salt. She says have a pinch of salt in case you use lard. Now, of course, if you use butter as your shortening, you usually salt your butter when you make it, so that's why. Back in the 1830s, sugar was scarce and hard to get, but almost everyone had access to sorghum or molasses. In fact, my great-great-grandmother's sister was married to William Huff, and he ran the neighborhood sorghum mill. And so sorghum was plentiful. They raised it here on the farm, and of course that's what we had for sweetener. So the original recipe calls for a cup of molasses. I've cut that in half, and so I'm just going to add about half a cup, or maybe just a little bit more. Sometimes this is called a gill. So I'm going to stir that in. And then, of course, Mrs. Child says that we're supposed to add 3/4 of a cup of cider. But she also says later on that if that makes your batter too thin, then next time you do it, leave out some of the liquid. Now, in this case, I don't have any cider. I don't think we really need it anyway. But if we do, and if we would like for our molasses to mix a little bit easier, what I could do is just simply add a little bit of hot water. Other modern recipes talk about using coffee. Sometimes they use hot water. And of course, Mrs. Child used cider. That would help too, because if that cider was a little bit hard, then it would essentially be starting to turn into vinegar, which would give us more of an acid content that would help the soda to work. Now, molasses itself is acidic, and that's why the baking soda will cause that to foam up, and that will cause that to make carbon dioxide gas, which is going to be our leavening. Now we can see this is a little bit too thick. At the end of her recipe, she says you want this to be just thick enough to work it into the pan. But in this case, I think that we're just a little bit too thick for that. It's almost like a dough. And so what I'm going to do here is just add a little tiny bit of hot water and try to get this to mix. For baking here at the cabin, we use this baking kettle or Dutch oven. And so we've got inside of here a trivet that holds the baking pan up off the bottom about a ½ inch. And I found this is very helpful because if it sits right on the bottom, oftentimes it'll scorch it. So by putting that in there, it sort of keeps things from burning on the bottom. And with coals underneath and coals on the top, it usually browns the whole batch of gingerbread in about a ½ hour. At home in the oven, when we have 350 degrees constantly, we bake it in 35 minutes. So today we'll try that, see how close that comes. But the way things worked in the 1830s was you just baked it till it was done, because sometimes the heat was up, sometimes the heat was a little bit lower, but eventually it would finish up if you keep plenty of hot coals above and below the oven. Let's go ahead and get some of those coals in there now from the firebox. Had the fire burning several hours now. We've got lots and lots of coals. And they are really, really hot. So we'll put a few underneath. And then we'll put in our liner pan with our gingerbread in there. Try to get that centered up. And then we'll go ahead and put the coals on the top of this. The toothpick test says that our gingerbread is done. So let's get that out of the Dutch and let's get it served up. Our gingerbread's done here, and so we're going to go ahead and get it out of the pan. So first thing I think we'll do is get it on this cooling rack. It should come out of there, hopefully pretty easily. And it did. And now what we'll do is go ahead and get it onto our plate here. Our gingerbread is ready. So let's go ahead and give it a slice here and see how things look. See how Mrs. Child's recipe turns out. Looks like we're done all the way through. Looks like it's a pretty good texture. It's tender. We're saying it's a success. Well, thanks for joining me today for this session of Pioneer Cooking. And so, we're going to enjoy some gingerbread, some Earl Grey tea, and just enjoy life here in the 1830s. Thanks for watching.